So often through this interview that you and I have been talking, Al, the name Duncan Cameron has come up. And I thought you just might take some time to give a focused perspective on who Duncan Cameron is, how he relates to you, and a little bit about his background and what he's doing today.
Okay. Duncan Cameron, full name Alexander Duncan Cameron, Jr. I met, quite aside from the Montauk Project, to put in perspective how I met him, and then, of course, how it filled out later. But as I met him was in 1985 at the United States Psychotronics Conference in Dayton, Ohio. Preston Nichols was there. I had met him 2 years earlier in another conference. And he brought along his new lab assistant, as he called him, Duncan Cameron. And I met him, and he was part of one of the demonstrations on the stage with some of Preston's equipment. Talked with him at length the next day in the cafeteria for this organization, which is on one of the religious grounds in Dayton, Ohio, one of the retreats, which was very suitable for this type of conference. And we talked for about 3 hours in the cafeteria, and I found him to be very talkative, very communicative, very sensitive. It's one of the things I was interested in, the fact that he was a sensitive and a very good one. And after about an hour and a half of the discussion, I asked Duncan, I said, "Do you have the feeling that possibly you know me from somewhere?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Do you have any idea from where?" He says, "No." I said, "Well, I have the same feeling about you, but I don't have any more idea than you do where from." And before we left at that conference, I figured out I probably knew him from a past life, which happened to be quite correct. More than one, by the way, but we're only discussing Duncan as Duncan is today in his current body, etc. As the conference broke up, Preston gave me an invite, Preston Nichols, to come visit him in Long Island sometime. He says, "I'm always looking for good engineers for my lab." He at that time had a lab running in which he was doing quite a bit of research aside from his regular job, which was at AIO Corporation on Long Island. Now, to fill in a little more about Duncan, of course, I met him when I went there in August of '85 to see Preston, and I met Duncan. I stayed at his house, in fact.
This isn't Long Island, right?
This isn't Long Island, actually Babylon, Long Island.
Okay.
And he lives on a little island called Cap Tree Island, which was, in years gone by, a hunting retreat. And the reason he was there is because he inherited this house, a hunting lodge, which is what his father called it. And he used to live there sometimes during the summer, but usually he used it more as a retreat than anything else. And when Father died, in quotes, legally, he died or was declared dead in 1981, Duncan and his sister inherited what was left of the trust fund, plus the house, which became a joint ownership between he and his sister. And the house, of course, was this famous hunting lodge out on Cap Tree Island, which was quite literally set up as a little lodge. And there were a lot of other houses on the island, but this has been, from that period about 1981 on, Duncan's residence to this day. But I went there, I met him, and talked with him a lot more. We went out on a famous trip to Montauk Point, which resulted in awakening at a later date our memories of what was ongoing at Montauk and the fact that both Duncan and I had been involved in it.
Well, when you first met Duncan, did he at that time have any recovered memories of Montauk or the Philadelphia experiment?
None whatever, any more than I did. Nor for that matter did Preston. Preston, of course, had been a mainstay of the Montauk Project, but he had no recall of it at that time because his famous comment was in August of 1985, when I went out to visit, he's going to take Duncan and I out to a place on the eastern end of Long Island, which he says, "I know you've never been there before." Ho, 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 that was a joke of the century, but at that point Preston didn't know it. Mm-hmm. He did not know that he also had been involved. And that's when we went out there and he tested our abilities to read, so to speak, and what we might discover about the place in the process of going there on what was supposedly our first visit. Well, it was our first visit in 1985, after the whole project had crashed. But, of course, we've been there many, many times prior when we were actually working the project. But I got to know Duncan a little better as time went on, and, of course, I moved to Long Island in 1986, the summer of '86. I did get work on Long Island because I couldn't get work anywhere else in the country at that time. There was sort of a recession on in engineering. And I went to work with a company on the island, which did instrumentation kinds of work for various other companies on the island, particularly Grumman Aircraft and some of the other big ones. And they had their own little projects ongoing with Brooklyn Union Gas and what have you to provide instrumentation and various subsystems that they may require. Well, during that time, I saw Duncan a lot more, and we got better acquainted. My job came to an abrupt end in February of 1987 when, as the president of the company put it to me, he says, the bean counters have been in here, and a lot of my bills are not being paid, and he says, if I don't cut back, he says, I'm going to be in very serious financial trouble. So I was the last guy hired, so I was the first one out the door. And many followed after me. He was not picking on me. It was a case of he was told he had to cut back. Since I was not producing that much hardware or what have you for him, I was sort of a department head. I went out the door. A few others went. And as the time went on, about 50% of their staff, which was about 60 people, went out the door. It was 120 total when I was there. So I went back to Phoenix and kept in touch with Duncan and Preston and visited them many times after that. Now to go into, as I was able to put it together, the earlier history of Duncan, that is the current Duncan. He was born on June 28th, 1951, of the same father, Alexander Duncan Cameron Sr., and his mother at that time was Alexander's fifth wife, actually third legal, but fifth in fact. And the sister was born first. And Duncan followed on the 28th of June of 1951.
Where was Duncan born?
On Long Island, I believe. And I'm not sure whether he was born in Bayshore or where exactly, but it was on Long Island. His father was living on Long Island at that time, essentially, and was in and out of the lodge, but he also had a home in Sarasota, Florida. So I'm not entirely sure at this point whether Duncan was born in Sarasota, Florida, or whether it was on Long Island. His father did spend a lot of time in Sarasota. That's where he had his other home. And his fifth wife lived there and continued on living there. He used to come up occasionally to Long Island. I met her once. But Duncan was born at that time, and the strange part about it, which we were able to put together, and this is after the fact, not knowing it at that time, the real Duncan, that is the soul, if you will, of Duncan did not inhabit that body at birth. There was a surrogate soul involved. And the real soul of Duncan, who came from Montauk in the future, from the dying body of the old Duncan, was transferred to the new body, was on, strangely enough, the 12th of August, 1963, when he was 12 years old, a little past the age of, point of 12, but when he was 12. The reason we know that is because much later, when Preston was doing the deprogramming and trying to find out the deprogramming of Duncan and trying to find out what his real history was, because when Duncan left the Montauk Project and Preston started to regress him back into that period when he was there, he had a great deal of problems, and as I witnessed more than once, he had about 6 different personalities, one of which was the Duncan we knew. Another one was the station personality. We don't know who the rest were. Maybe one of them was a facsimile of the original Duncan, but I don't think so. But what happened was that in the process of going through this, Preston was using a number of techniques, which included, among other things, hypnosis. And he took him back in hypnosis from the time when Duncan was at that time about 40-something years. This was in 96, so it had been about 45. He was regressing him backwards to try and find out what the problems were, where they developed, and of course went through the whole 9 yards at Montauk. And then kept regressing and took him back to the age of 12. And at the age of 12, it seemed to be the Duncan we knew. He says, we'll take you back a little further. Where are you? What's happening? And so forth. And this is when Duncan came up under hypnosis with the fact that he was on the Eldridge. And there were people there that he knew today. One of them, he says, I know as Al today. And so forth. And the interesting point was, when we went back earlier than the age of 12, there was not the Duncan we knew anymore. There was somebody else who was in that body, who was apparently glossed over. And it was a surrogate soul.
So that's the point where you think Duncan entered.
That is the point where we determined that Duncan entered, was at the age of slightly after 12, actually on the 12th of August.
So that'd be considered, what I think, a walk-in, right?
He was absolutely a walk-in, and it was a planned walk-in. Why they wanted to do it on that date, whoever was running this show and planning it, I don't know.
Did you say August the 12th, 1963?
1963, August 12th.
And just for everybody listening, that's a date that just keeps coming up all the time. August the 12th, and then the threes, the 43, 63, 83, 2003.
So with that, Duncan became aware of the fact that he had led more than one life, so to speak, that he'd been involved in the Philadelphia experiment. He did not then remember very much about it, except that he and I ran the equipment for the invisibility tests, and he has remembered very little about the trips into the future. But as the Duncan of this lifetime, he went through a lot of problems. He was approached more than once, and he used to tell me about this, by certainly the intelligence people, the intelligence community, apparently involved in certain of the resurrected activities of Montauk. And he used to tell me at the time, because at one time he was a rather heavy drinker. This is the Duncan I know of this lifetime, I'm speaking. And after the time of the Montauk project ending, but before I met him, and before the deprogramming started, he used to go out and drink quite a bit on the bars on the island. And he told the story about one day he was in one of the bars, and they said he noticed a car pull up in front. Two men got out. They came in, grabbed him, took him out to the car, and drove off with him. He says he has no idea where he went or what happened from that point on. But he said this was not a lone occurrence. This happened more than once. There were other occasions where, after the deprogramming sequence was well along, and it was made obvious that they still wanted him back on Long Island at the eastern tip as part of the Montauk project, he refused to become part of it. He didn't want to be part of it anymore. Apparently they grabbed him more than once and took him out there and put him back in the chair for whatever purposes, because he was very well known as the principal operator in the chair, the one that was the best, not the only one. But there were various projects they wanted him for, and apparently this was after the collapse in '83. And whether or not it was all at the Montauk Point operation, I'm not sure, because he is not too clear on these memories, except he knows that he was grabbed and to be taken back there more than once. As time went on and the deprogramming continued, he finally said to Preston, I want all of these memories, all of these connections in the past flushed out. I don't want any more buried stuff. I want it all out in the open, and I wanted to get rid of all of these memories of the old scenario, whatever it was that I was involved in.
Did he want to get rid of them, or did he want to remember them?
Basically, he wanted to get rid of them. He couldn't do that without bringing it up into normal memory first. And as time went on, and I was kept apprised of this, he brought up more and more memories of various things he'd been involved in, and the more painful ones of Montauk he really didn't want to go into, but he had to go into it at least to some extent. And he says, I want to be rid of this, I don't want any more connection with it, and I don't want any more connection with Montauk. Well, finally, when they got him through, rather completely deprogrammed, they stopped trying to use him for Montauk, and any attempts to get him back were by verbal communication, in which he said, no, I want no part of it, period, forget it. They didn't attempt to drag him off anymore. They tried to do it by a forward face-to-face conference, and we would like to have you, we will pay you, or whatever the thing is they were trying to get him to accept, and he said, no, I'm through with it. So he became disconnected completely with that, and the memories of actually those parts he played at Montauk probably to this day are still quite painful to him, because now the memories have largely faded. He does not want any reason to recollect them. He does not want to recollect them. At the present time, and I'm speaking of the last, let's say, 2 years or so, 2 to 3 years, a number of people have talked with him, including a very good lady friend of mine who knows both of us quite well. she's sort of a sensitive, and she's trying to get Duncan to accept the past, and at that point, accepting it, that it was something which was part of his life, then dismiss it if he wants to, but he should have the memories available at a conscious level so that he can do what he wants with them and recognize the psychic and psychological pressures that are still on him as being part of the memories he won't face. He still refuses to face them. And to this day, that is the case. He doesn't want to talk about any of it now. He wants to literally relegate it to some past history and tie it up in a nice black bag very neatly and throw it out the window and hope it goes away and stays away.
Now, you still have a continuous relationship with him. I assume you talk to him on a regular basis.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
He's still very friendly with me. Some people he's cut off and doesn't want to talk with. And when it comes to anyone who wants to interview him or resurrect the past, he's basically against it. Now, he has gone out public once or twice in the lectures on the Philadelphia experiment. He did this one in New Jersey, one group, which is having another annual convention first weekend of October coming. But Duncan won't go to any of these anymore, and he's very reluctant to talk with anyone about the past. He said the past is the past. Now, to give you some idea of why they were so concerned, when I say they, I'm not sure who they are, and neither does Preston know for sure who they are, except it's in the intelligence community, or those who worked with Psychor and other of these groups of that type.
Are these just people that show up out of nowhere?
They used to do this. They don't anymore. But when he was in the process, Duncan was in the process of being deprogrammed, we found out that he had a level of communication with, let us say, an upper level of some kind that was unbelievable. He could set up, as Preston did, in his laboratory, and I'm talking about Preston's lab. He has a lot of antique receivers and a lot of other electronic devices. Preston was quite amazed because Duncan could go to these receivers and set them at certain specific frequencies on the receiving channel, and do this about 6 or 8 receivers, and it would work to be some sort of a communicating link for Duncan. And he could do these to read into the future what was going to happen. And he was doing this on a fairly regular basis. At some point he got tired of it or fed up with it. I'm not quite sure what happened, but he didn't want to have any more part of this. And eventually disconnected from Preston.
Do you recall, did he ever actually make any predictions about the future?
Yes, he did.
Do you remember what they were?
At this point, no, I do not remember specifically what they were, but they were relatively accurate. I would say his batting average was well above 50%. I would not say 100%. I would say it was probably in the vicinity of 80, 85, which is quite high. And it was mostly local stuff, things related to what was happening to Preston or to myself and what was going to happen in the near future.
Then you said all of a sudden he just lost interest in that.
All of a sudden he lost interest in it and wanted no further part of it. Mm-hmm. And he started to pull out of everything, and eventually he didn't even want to talk with Preston anymore. For a while this was the case. He avoided Preston. Wouldn't come over to the lab. Wouldn't do anything.
Did he actually work for Preston?
Yes, he did for a period of time. Excuse me. There was a period. This was around 88, 90, 91. This was before any of the deprogramming attempts being made to find out his past from Montauk. And the history of how that happened is rather curious, because about 1986, he showed up at Preston's doorstep one day carrying a piece of electronic equipment. It was a hi-fi receiver amplifier. And it says to Preston, "I've been told that you are a person who is good at repairing this kind of equipment. I bought this from somebody locally and it doesn't work and they won't do anything about it. Maybe you can fix it for me." Well, Preston was rather astonished. This guy came in, he looked at him, he didn't know who he was at that point, but he rather liked the guy, and I was talking about Duncan, of course. He says, "Yeah, I'll come on in." I says, talk with him a bit. And realized that this was a rather unusual person, and he says, "Yeah, I'll see what I can do about fixing the equipment," and he did. Now, from that point on, Preston, this was after Montauk was over, and of course before the resurrection of Montauk and the resurrection of the fact of all of our involvements, which came quite a bit later, like 95, 96, and so on. He had Duncan working for him in the lab, and they found out that Duncan was able to do some electronic things. He also was quite skilled at carpentry, and he started doing work for Duncan, that is, started doing work for Preston and his father around the house. And he started doing other work in the way of carpentry, and he was also skilled at building cabinetry and such, and he built some boxes for the radio sound, which Preston called it, and manufactured and sold. Preston built the electronics, as it were, and Duncan built the box that some of the stuff and the coils went into. Now, he did a very nice job. I still have one of them. It's a beautiful piece of miniature cabinetry, if you will. But he was skilled to that. But he was also quite sensitive, and Duncan eventually became part of Preston's entourage of sensitives who used to do readings for him, and sometimes for other people. He used to do this for... he wasn't doing it for money, he was just doing it for the fact that he was interested in it, was able to do it. And Duncan had some kind of a subconscious urge to help people. So he used to do this. He made no money out of it. His money was made strictly from his vocation, which was adopted about 86 of carpentry. And where the skill came from, who knows? But he suddenly found he had a skill for carpentry, and he became part of that. And that developed into his business, first working for others and eventually striking out on his own, which never was too successful financially. He had a lot of work, but he never made much money, if any, at it.
Well, from his father, though, did his father leave him enough money to be
For
well
a period
off?
of time, that was true. When father legally died in 1991, he did not actually die. What happened was he went into a coma, was sent into the hospital, and the doctor looked at him and all of the vital signs and said, he's never going to come out of it. He's going to die this way. So at some point, he was declared legally dead, and they divided up his estate. His estate consisted of a trust fund, which father had been living off of, plus the beach house and so forth. The trust fund amounted to about, I think it was a little over $100,000, $135,000 or so. So Duncan got $45,000, his sister got $45,000, and somebody else, I guess it was his wife, got $45,000. And the house, by will, went to Duncan and his sister. Then father embarrassed everybody by coming out of his little coma after about 45 days. Legally, the guy's dead. So what does he do? He ran around the island. Nobody knows for sure what he did, but he had friends he used to stay with, and he used to be a person who turned up. He had a habit of drinking a bit. He wasn't a heavy drinker. But he would turn up at various bars in the island, and he was seen by people who knew him. He says, he isn't dead. We saw him. He's around here, so-and-so, and he's been seen by so-and-so. And a number of people told me this.
Now, did he actually ever really die?
Yes, he definitely did. The way we found out about that was very curious. Now, this involves another missing brother that turned up in Germany. A father had kids all over the place. We never knew where they all were, but about 2 years ago, Vince, who calls himself by a different name, Peter Moon, as a pseudonym for Sky Books, which has published all the Preston's books, has a lot of correspondence around the world, and he got a letter from somebody in Germany saying, forward this on to Al. So he forwarded it on to me, and it was a letter from a guy in Germany who wrote me in rather broken English, but very readable, that he was a missing brother, and he wanted to talk with me on the phone. He says he was born in 1950, and he apparently has one of these persons who didn't know who his real father was. He was adopted very early on. And as he told me on the phone, partly in the letter and the rest of it on the phone.
Would this be a Bielek or a Cameron missing?
Neither.
Oh.
He was not even a Cameron legally. But he remembers that in 1956, at the age of 6, this man, Alexander Duncan Cameron Sr., came over to Germany, picked him up, announced that he was his real father. He knew he had a real father, but he didn't know who it was. Took him to a garden party in Dortmund, Germany, about June of 56. And he says, here I am, 6 years old, running around this party, and all of these members of state, heads of state were there, and father was there and talking with all of them. He says, well, who were they he was talking with? What was this all about? He says, I don't know what it was about, but I can tell you who was there. But he says, because I remember it. So you had President Eisenhower from the United States. You had Mr. Churchill, Prime Minister Churchill from England, the then Premier of France in 1956, forgotten the name of it, and of course Mr. Joe Stalin of Russia. And I said, and Father was hobnobbing with these people? He said, yes. I says, I don't know what was going on. But I said, I know he was there, and there's a couple of days of this meeting. And I found out about this. I called Preston, and I told him about this. He says, good Lord. I said, this I got to dig into. And I said, of course, remember, the rumor was Father didn't die in 81. He says, yes, I know about the rumor. He finally got a hold of the right people because at this time Preston was back in the Air Force and had a clearance and was in intelligence. He was reserved, but nevertheless in intelligence. And he started digging, and he found the records for Father. Father had a level 7 clearance and a crypto from the Pentagon and was all over, and they didn't pull his clearance until sometime in mid-1985.
Wow.
Now, they don't keep a level 7 clearance alive on somebody after they're dead.
How important is a level 7 clearance?
That's much higher than the presidential level. The president
is
typically
it the highest? Is it
no,
the highest level?
No, the highest level, when you go by levels, that goes now up to level 33.
Oh my gosh.
And
where would the president be then?
Typically level 3, maybe 5.
You mean there's 30 levels above the president of clearance?
Yes. Particularly the present president. It's very strange because I wasn't aware of this. And you see, this is totally a new system for classification because originally they talked about confidential, secret, top secret,
Right.
cosmic, top secret, and so forth. This was the old system. They totally changed this now. And in other services and groups, they still have some of the older jargon, but in terms of the Air Force and the military and the very secret organizations, they go by levels now, level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, on up to 33. The highest level I'd heard of that anybody ever had was a 15, and that was a guy who was the director of the so-called Wingmakers project through ACIO. He had a level 15. I didn't know there was anything higher than that, and I've since found out, yes, there's levels up to 33. Father had a level 7, which was quite high. And most presidents don't get above 5. I'm sure that the man who became the president, the former director of the CIA, George Bush Sr., probably had a level 7 or better. I do not know what level he had, but I'm sure he had better than a 5.
Just a guess.
That's a guess, strictly.
Well, getting back to Duncan, though,
Yeah.
because that's what we're talking about here. Are you trying to finish a point?
Yeah. The point was that Father was involved in things far beyond our comprehension.
Mm-hmm.
And he was, throughout all of those years, even as we found out later during the years when the new Duncan was involved in the Montauk Project, he used to see the director on a fairly regular basis to make sure that Duncan is properly taken care of, that he is okay. He did not know that I.L. Bielek, being part of the Montauk Project, was one of his missing sons. Father didn't know everything, and I perhaps was never apprised of what had really happened to me because that was one of the deepest, darkest secrets of the Navy. Duncan didn't know, and he accepts it now, but it took him years to accept the fact that I was his brother.
Now, you as Al Bielek, did you ever meet your real father?
No, I did not. That's one of the curious things. I moved to Long Island. I took the trip in 85, and he died in 85. I was there in August of 85. Of course, I've been to Long Island prior to that many, many times, but with no knowledge of my past. And there wouldn't be any reason why my father would be looking me up at that time, because he wouldn't have known what had happened to me. At least I don't think he would have known. However, there's one person, a very good psychic, who said he did know. And he used to look in on me regularly with my 2 brothers, and I thought, 2 brothers? Who are they? Number 1 was Duncan, and number 2 was the guy from Germany. It is possible that he knew, but in the times of my visits to Long Island over the years, I had no reason to know anything about my past. And at the time when I went there in August of 85, I still didn't know about my past, but that was prior to that was when Father actually died, sometime in 1985. I don't know when. It's unfortunate because I never did meet him face to face.
Do you know where he was buried?
No. I'm not even sure he was buried. He might have been cremated. But the recollection I have from the family records they dug up at a later date was that he was buried in someplace on Long Island.
Did Duncan ever talk about the funeral?
No, never did.
Just that he had died, that's all.
Yeah.
Okay.
See, it was a secret from the family. He lived on until 85. He disappeared. He went in the hospital. He didn't disappear. He went in the hospital. He allegedly died in the hospital. Then he was resurrected. They had him all legally dead with no corpus delicti because he was still alive in a coma in the hospital. Then he recovers.
Mm-hmm.
And that became an enormous problem for the family, and I guess everybody sort of swept it under the rug. I don't know actually what the rest of the family did when he revived, but it was ignored, and there was no clear-cut answer to what had really happened to him.
Okay. Now, going back into the 70s, so you and Duncan at Montauk during the Mind Control Project actually worked together.
That's correct.
But not knowing who each one of you were.
That's correct.
Right?
I did not know that he was my brother. He did not know that I was his brother. He only knew me as Al Bielek, as somebody who was picked up who had certain talents and abilities, was part of the project. And I guess you could call me a psychic director, and I'm not sure what category Duncan was in, except that he was a psychic and number one for the chair for all of the various operations that were needed. And he was also a programmer for the early phases of the Montauk Boys program. So he had more than one hat that he wore, so to speak. Preston wore more than one, and obviously I wore more than one hat. So I was involved in several different things. But Duncan used to get dragged off into some other aspects. He was involved somewheres on the periphery of some of the biological experimentation. And I don't know much about that. He was also, strangely enough, he survived. He was also involved in some of the Montauk Boys orchestra scenarios and singing. When Duncan was a little younger, back in the period of the 70s, he had an incredibly good voice. Absolutely incredible. Preston still has the recordings he made of Duncan, and I listened to this, I could hardly believe it. He sounded like almost a soprano voice. Not quite, but very close to a soprano voice. And he sang with an incredible amount of emotion in the recordings that he made. They became released through Broadway or whatever the channels are in New York for the CDs and such. There were a lot of recordings made which came out on some CDs. Some of them were best hits. But none of these kids ever had their real names used, and none of them ever received a cent of royalties. What royalties were received went into the coffers of the Montauk Project.
Did he actually lose that talent later on, though?
Yes, he did. Whether it was he had it because of the fact that he was at Montauk, because of some of the programming he was under or what, I don't know. But it's something I'm going to have to approach Preston about and see if he can resurrect some of those tapes. Of course, Duncan has the right to say no. I don't know whether Duncan would want them resurrected or not.
So Duncan actually, he worked in the Montauk Boys program as a programmer.
Yeah.
He was on the chair.
And he was also a performing artist for some of the recordings.
Mm-hmm. And he did time travel himself.
And he did time travel himself. Oh, yes, very definitely.
Or space travel, let's just say as well. Location travel.
Time, space, yeah.
Okay. Can you note any of the interesting trips that he may have taken?
Yes. About 1982, they got a message relayed to Montauk from NASA, from the from the Mars colonies. There are colonies on the moon too, but from the Mars colonies, that they had located what appeared to be sealed-off entrances to the underground, which, whether it was a cavern system or not, they weren't sure, but they were obviously artificially sealed off. And they said, we don't have the equipment or the machinery here to break into these. We'd like somebody to do something about this and tell us what we might be able to do about it. So the information was relayed to Montauk. And Montauk asked for the exact coordinates of at least one of these areas where they appeared to be an entrance to an underground system of some kind. So they gave them the coordinates, and they said, okay, we'll send a camera into the underground here, and if We lose the camera because it's solid rock and there's nothing there but rock. There's no loss. Well, they send the camera in running, and of course, on its own power supply, let it sit there for a while, and they brought it back, and it came back intact, which I got the pictures. There was obviously an underground of some kind in the area, which had been noted by those on the surface in the colonies. So they sent a crew in, since they found out there was a real underground, and they sent a crew to explore. Duncan and I and others were on this crew.
And this is Mars.
This is Mars.
Wow.
The planet Mars. And this was in 1982, approximately, when they did this. Sometime in 82, I don't recall exactly when. And we went in there more than once. And they found vast underground operations, not just caverns. These were complete habitats. They had been obviously occupied at one time. There's all the remains of a civilization, of records, of statuary, of rooms, corridors, long passageways, with various rooms and sections and living facilities off of them. We didn't explore them very far, but it was obviously went on for miles.
So when you say there was a crew, who was actually in this crew?
Duncan, myself, and a group of other people recruited apparently from Montauk, but it might also have been a different crew included on that. I don't know who all the other people were. They could have had people from NASA, from all I know.
About how many other people were there?
There were about 7 in the crew. They typically pick crews of about 7.
And when they would send you to Mars, physically, how did they do that?
Through the Montauk Tunnel.
Yeah.
In other words, the tunnel would be operational. The green light was on, which says it was safe to travel. We'd walk up to it, and we'd be sucked through the tunnel in succession, all 7 of us, and we wind up in this specific underground point at Montauk.
Was it an
at Mars.
At Mars, yeah. Was it a uncomfortable experience? Or?
No, not uncomfortable. You were sort of sucked down the tunnel, and you were essentially comfortable. The earlier phases I've heard were not very comfortable, but you were propelled down this tunnel, which looked like the large esophagus of some animal, like a giant dinosaur or some such thing, because it was rough, like an esophagus.
Would you bounce around a little bit?
Nah, there was a little motion back and forth, but you never hit the walls. And it was lit. Why it was lighting in there, we don't know. It was not black.
Did you keep your mental faculties with you
Yes,
the whole time?
You did. You knew who you were and where you had come from and roughly where you were going. At least on that one you did.
And about how long did it take from the time you were sort of jumped into the tunnel to the time you got to your destination?
In that case, as I remember, it's approximately 2 minutes, or perhaps a little less.
That long?
That long.
It seems like you'd be...
Much faster.
Well, also kind of scary. I mean, for 2 minutes you're in this reality, which
This is my memory at this point. Maybe it wasn't that long. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah.
In any case, we bounce out and land on the floor of the deck. I'm sure we didn't always land upright on our feet. And pick ourselves up, and we get the team together, and we go exploring. We took cameras, we took lighting with us, because there was no evidence of any lighting there functioning. There probably was.
Okay, we're in Mars.
On Mars, right, on the underground. So we brought our own lighting, high-powered electric lights, and we'd split the team up and go exploring and see what we could find. Took a lot of pictures of everything. And after a certain predetermined time, we would have to be back at the point where we came in, and the tunnel would be there, and we would jump into it, and it would take us back. The reverse phase on it, and it would take us back to Montauk.
Would there have to be a certain specific time that you'd have to show up at a certain specific location in order for that to work? And
yes, to both.
Okay, and what happens if you didn't show up?
If we didn't show up, being as they knew we were there someplace, what they would do is they would beam the tunnel back, if you will, maybe 10 minutes later or whatever. There was a prearranged code for this in case we weren't back in time. In another 15 minutes or whatever, they would send the tunnel again until we all showed up and were brought back. They did this a couple of times, and then Duncan and I decided, well, why don't we go exploring on our own? Because, after all you have to do is punch in the keys of a computer, punch in the code for that program, and with the computers would set the whole thing up automatically with all of the corrections for celestial mechanics of where the planet was and so forth, and it was all automatically corrected. So we punched it in, and green light came on. We both jumped in the tunnel and wound up in the underground there, and we went exploring on our own. It was on one of those trips, I don't know if it's the first one or the second one, we made 2 trips on our own, quite unauthorized. The second one, I think it was, Duncan found that there was a control panel someplace, and he accessed this thing and opened it up and found out there's a bunch of switches there and started flipping switches. The next thing we know, the lights came on. What the source of the power was, we have no idea. It was not there locally. It was some remote location, which we never found, but the lights came on, and then we didn't have to carry our own lighting around. And we started digging around all over the place, found some records. Duncan, for whatever reason, was able to read some of them. We brought some of them back. We brought a few things back on our own, but we didn't bring much back because our trips were unauthorized. Well, in the second return, they were waiting for us. I said, you've been out on your own, huh? I said, yeah. They were slapped us on the wrist, no severe penalties, but A, you're not going on any more trips on your own there again, and B, they split Duncan and I up from working together as a team on this sort of thing.
Oh, they didn't put you in the stockade for a week or
No,
so?
they didn't put us in the stockade.
Now I have heard from other sources that you actually were in the stockade. You may not have a memory of that.
No.
But that was interesting thing. Now, most people who are going to listen to this are going to want to know more about what you actually saw when you were in Mars.
Well, that I saw personally.
Yeah.
There was a lot of records and files, and in fact, enormous numbers of files. And
what did the writing look like?
I looked at some of it. It looked like a very alien squiggle. I think we could perhaps just give the best simile and say it looked like Arabic. For what reason Duncan was able to read some of it, I don't know. Maybe some of it was Arabic. I'm a language man. Preston couldn't know languages. Duncan apparently knew some foreign languages. I did not know what.
Did he actually tell you what some of the words were?
He did tell me a little bit about what some of it was about, and he said it was quite important. And he came to the conclusion that it wasn't too far back in time that the last remnants of Mars apparently had died out.
Not too far?
Not too far back into the past.
Really?
And what he was able to decipher, NASA, of course, got a hold of these records later, and I heard about this from other channels. They figured out that the surface works where the cities were originally had died out in some huge cataclysm or some war or whatever it was, destroyed the cities about 350,000 years ago, and those people who survived it went into the underground. Perhaps they knew it was coming, built a huge underground facility under quite a large part of the planet. And the survivors from this, whatever it was that hit Mars, apparently about 10,000 at the time, went into the underground and survived there for quite a long period of time. Might have been more than 10,000, but the NASA's conclusion was that the life terminated finally in the underground of Mars about 10,000 years ago.
Is there any traces that they came here, though, or any evidence?
None that NASA recognizes, but it is interesting to note that the legends of the Native American Indians all talk about the fact that they came on great silver rings from the red planet, that they were transferred here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's in the native legends, that they came from the red planet, the planet of war. I know a number of Native Americans, and they talk about it more privately than they do openly, but they're not that concealing of it. Mm-hmm. They've talked about it at some of their powwows and some of the open sessions where the public is invited.
But you didn't find any evidence to that effect when you were
I did not
there?
Myself, no.
Okay.
This information comes directly from certain Native Americans who told me this is what the legends state, mm-hmm. and this is the way the Native Americans got here.
Okay, so when you were underground, what did the walls look like?
They were all well finished. They weren't raw concrete or steel. They were all well finished in what appeared to be plastic-like materials, covered with what could be paint, what could be a plasticized covering. Mm-hmm. Very smooth, well done, and designed to be living quarters, working quarters, whatever. We ran into some of the living quarters, with which we didn't investigate very thoroughly because we were more concerned with finding what was left of the old technology, what was left of any lab facilities, production facilities, whether libraries. Yes, we ran across some libraries, and I'm sure they ran across much more after we were no longer invited along. There was some statuary, which was obviously religious statuary. Some of that was brought back, and For some reason, my father became involved with that from the stories we heard later. And that may have been buried on Long Island. Don't know for sure.
What were they statues of?
What we assumed were religious figures. They were 7 or 8 feet high. Some of them had religious aspects.
Such as like angels or something? Or
angelic-like characters, poses like this sort of thing. And
putting his hands up in the praying position.
And which, by general demeanor, appeared to be of religious significance to whoever it was that was there that had these things. They were all apparently stored in one particular room, which was rather unusual. They weren't scattered around, but they were in this one room. And apparently some of them, we took 1 or 2 of them out. We didn't bring them back with us, but later on others brought them back.
Do you know what they were made of? Were they made of gold?
There was gold adornment on some of them. Most of them looked, because of their age, looked to be like they might have been terracotta or marble or something like this, and had gold covering on them at one time, but the coloring on them was very badly faded.
Now, there must have been a lot of machinery or electrical equipment.
I never found any of it. Duncan never found any of it. I'm sure the other crews did, but we never found it in the initial time.
You said you saw a control panel, though.
Yeah, Preston found that. Duncan found that. And there was a panel he lifted up, and there was all kinds of switches under it. So he said, I wonder what these are. And started flipping them, suddenly flickering, and then the lights came on.
Okay. And so that set all the lights. So the 2 basic things that you found up there were records, lots and lots and lots of records.
Yes.
And the statues.
The statues.
Anything else?
Not that I can recall at this point.
Okay.
And
a total of how many trips did you make to Mars?
Well, Duncan and I on our own, too. Mm-hmm. The ones prior, there was 2 or 3 prior to that we went on. It was considered a major find, and they wanted to put as much effort into investigating it as they could. The trips kept on after that, but we were not part of it, and we were not even informed as to what they found.
So after they found out that you 2 had gone for a joyride, then...
An unauthorized trip, yes.
Now, okay, besides that, did you 2 take any other trips through this Montauk Tunnel to any other locations?
I did, yes. Duncan was not involved with those. And that was the 83 trip to this planet across the other side of the galaxy, 120,000 light years away, which I think I described previously, finding this strange cylindrical object. And then in 1987, we went to the other planet to get the other object. As far as I know, it was 2 separate planets. We had to wait 4 years because Montauk went down on the night of 12 August before part 2 of this trip was consummated. And they did it in 1987 with basically some of the same crew.
So it seems like it's important to have the same crew involved.
It is, because they're used to the trips. Some people apparently didn't like the trips and didn't get along very well. The stories I hear is Preston went on 1 or 2 trips and he got rather ill. Some people got violently ill.
But for you, it was
no problem. No problem. Nor for Duncan, nor for any of the other people we knew. And some of the people we knew on those trips were, strangely enough, one of the people was my number 2 son. He was involved in those particular trips to the other side of the galaxy.
Seems to be a certain, perhaps, genetic makeup that you need in order to
There is a genetic makeup that's required for certain of these trips. That's true. And they did, all the recruits to Montauk were very carefully examined genetically.
See, and I think what would be interesting is if you could go back to the genetics of your father.
Yes, it would be very interesting if I could.
And see what he is really made of. And my bet would be there's something different about him.
I'm sure there was. Something very different that he fitted so well. I am quite sure they have his DNA on file someplace, his DNA records, because he lived through the 80s and they were doing DNA filing earlier than the 80s.
No. We'll probably never find it, but
I'm sure it exists.
Yeah.
Oh, I know that of the personnel that were used in the Philadelphia experiment, all of them had DNA samples taken and were put in cryogenic deep freeze.
Did they know about DNA back then?
They knew enough about it to realize, well, they couldn't type it, they couldn't characterize it at that point, but they knew enough that they said in the future, we will be able to type this, and it is important for future reference. So they took tissue samples of everybody and was put in cryogenic deep freeze.
Okay, because as I recall, it was in the 60s, I believe, when they discovered what DNA was.
Yeah. Well, they already had an inkling that
So
it
they
would
took
be
a lot of
important.
samples.
They took a lot of samples.
Okay, so you yourself, with another team, took a few trips to different planets on the other side of the universe or the galaxy?
Galaxy.
To the galaxy. To get these cylindrical vessels?
Yes.
Right? And for what did we need those for?
That's a very good question, because the orders were to pick them up and bring them back, handle them very carefully. Don't touch them with your bare hands. Use protective clothing. We had full protective clothing, including face masks and everything, and heavy gloves, so that when we picked them up, we wouldn't make any direct contact with the actual object itself. They told us that they were hot, not radioactive, but very hot in terms of energy, which we would best not get a direct contact with.
I mean, did these planets have Earth's atmosphere to where you could breathe?
Similar. They were not identical.
But I mean, so you could appear there and still breathe and function. Pick these
We did
things
not
up and
actually
go.
take the chance on breathing the atmosphere there. We actually had our own air supplies in our suits.
You were in a suit. Okay.
Yeah, complete 100% suit. Now, one of them did. My number 2 son saw this object. There's nothing strange about this, heavy about it. I don't need these gloves. I can pick it up by hand. So he went and violated the rules. Says, I will pick this up. And he went and grabbed it by hand and found out it was hot and got burns on it. And they dropped this thing and it rolled across the terrain and wound up resting next to my legs with the suit clothing, of course, between me and the object. And we then came back and very carefully picked it up with the gloves and put it in the dollies, which were specially prepared for it, to literally hold them down on the dolly and then be able to move it around by moving the dolly rather than handling the object.
So what were these objects?
They were about 18 inches in diameter. They're about 4 feet long. They were not heavy. They were fairly light. I would say about 10 pounds, 15 pounds. They were classified as an object containing pure energy. One of them was pure dark energy, the one we picked it up, dark side energy, however you want to interpret that.
Is that like antimatter? Or is that different?
Not even antimatter. There wasn't no matter contained within this object. It was pure energy. And the other one we picked up later was the one with pure light energy, not meaning radiated light like such. I did not understand the significance of these things except on a metaphysical level, and I don't know what the reason was they wanted to get them, except the government was hot to get them, and they did. And they're still listed in classified readings, if you will, on certain sections of classified computers. In fact, Preston was able to determine that this little trip actually did happen, and they did get the cylinders that they wanted. They're still listed.
Was he able to find any uses of those?
No information was given on the usage.
Pure light and pure dark energy.
Yeah. Make of you what you will of that and what you want.
Okay. Quite an interesting trip there. You must have made several others. How about Duncan? Are there any
Duncan
trips?
made other trips after we were separated. I have no idea what he did from that point on.
How about before?
Before, relatively little. There were no trips made through the tunnel of any note until about 1979, because that's when they finally got the thing working the way they wanted it to be working. Prior events were rather hazardous because they had quite a few casualties of equipment sent through the tunnel that suddenly disappeared because the tunnel collapsed. Or even 1 or 2 cases of people disappeared because the tunnel collapsed with somebody out in the middle of space. So they, as the saying was, I guess their atoms got scattered all over the universe.
Okay.
We never saw them again, obviously. Yeah. And they didn't take many hazardous trips that way. They was not intending to put anyone into direct hazard of their life. But they had to test it on occasions, and most of the time it worked, but occasionally it didn't. But by 1979, they found out what the problems were, all of them. They had them corrected, so it was very stable after that. They had no more dropouts of that nature. But until then, in 79, they didn't do much trip taking. It was from 79 on they did most of the taking of those kind of trips. And it was also from 79 on that they picked up the Montauk Boy candidates by use of the tunnel. You didn't have to pick them up physically anymore. And from that point on, of course, this process, this technology, was available to other locations because there were quite a number of stage sites which were converted. And even after they abandoned the rest of these stage sites, and eventually Montauk itself was shut down, the technology did show up elsewhere. I do not know where some of the other locations may be, but I do know that as of today, that is, say, the last 10 years, the Montauk Boys program has been ongoing in every major city in the U.S., and they don't go out and physically pound the pavement to get their recruits.
They just go pick them up through this tunnel, right?
Through a tunnel similar to what they had developed in Montauk.
Now wasn't there a station, 100,000 BC, that you had to go to?
Yes, there was. And I was there, and so was Duncan.
Okay.
And a number of other people we knew. We were stationed there for a period of time, and I do not know what the purpose was.
So you were sent down to this station.
Yeah, it's 100,000 years BC.
And you would say there was several people working there?
Yeah.
At the time?
There were quite a number working there at the time.
Right.
It was personnel was rotated. We were there for a period of time, and then they rotate personnel.
About how long would you stay there?
So I can recall now, probably about 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were brought back.
And it was on planet Earth, though, right?
As far as we know. Everything looked like it might have been Earth.
Yeah.
Whether it was in
they didn't tell you?
Our reality or alternate reality or what, we don't know. We were told that the station was established at 100,000 years into the past for research purposes. That was all that we were told. Now, what they were researching, I don't know.
What did you do there?
I can't even recall that.
Really?
What I did there was 3 weeks of it, and I don't know what I did.
So you and Duncan both went to this station.
Yeah. Huh. As I say, quite a number of personnel from the Montauk Project were there. They were rotated. And what the purpose of the research was, I don't know. There were no dinosaurs at that time, and as I recall, references were made to the human population on the planet at that time, and it was quite primitive. There was nothing stated that it was not humanoid, but it was considered very primitive, and it can raise other questions in this respect because of the basis of the knowledge I have now rather than the knowledge I had at that time, which was, let's say, sometime between 80 and 83. We had aliens on board the Montauk Project. But we also had some aliens back in that area. Now the question is, were they researching humans? Were they researching aliens, alien life forms at that remote time, or what? I don't really know what the function was.
So it's a fairly foggy memory then.
It's a little on the foggy side to this day.
You just know you've done it. You just can't remember the details. Also in our conversations, the trip to 6037, we discussed that in the future. And tell us about that. There was a certain gold statue that you guys saw.
Yes, that trip was one which every new recruit to the Montauk Project, myself or anyone who would be working there, or for that matter even the Montauk Boys, any new recruit, before they were fully accepted for whatever program they were to be in, had to take that trip into the future. And this, of course, was after the tunnel system was working correctly. And there were times when we went, and it's a little bit strange because I was recruited in 76 and the tunnel wasn't working right then, but somehow I made it through that tunnel. So it must have been functional, at least partially. And maybe it worked in certain time areas better than others. I don't know the answer to that. But I was required to make this trip up to 6037 AD, as was everyone else. And we were told that we would emerge in a traffic circle. We were not to walk outside of that traffic circle. They said we would see other things outside of it, but don't go out there. Report on what you see. You'll be there about 15 minutes. You can walk around inside the circle, but not outside. It says we have to keep you safe, and you have to be within that circle so we can bring you back at the predetermined time. So everybody reported the same thing, what I saw and everybody else saw. There was a gold statue of a horse, sort of standing up on his hind legs. sitting, or shall I say standing, on a pedestal, which was also apparently gold. It appeared to be solid gold for the horse and also for the pedestal.
Is this a statue that's on Preston's books?
Basically, it's a stylized drawing on the books.
Okay.
Based on the verbal renditions. Nobody has a picture of this actual horse that I know of.
I'm sure it's somewhere, though.
I think they may have one someplace, and it's probably well guarded. But in any case, we all reported the same thing. And there was a base, the pedestal, which had strange writings on it, hieroglyphic sort of things, which were not English. And there was a missing portion of the base, or like a piece of it was missing, taken out. And it was in a...
taken out or blown out?
It's hard to say what it was missing.
Yeah.
And it was in the middle of this traffic circle, and sat there as apparently a memorial to something. So we would look from beyond the circle, and all we would see is a road, a paved road around the circle, and roads radiating out from it. There's about 5 roads heading out from the circle, going off in the distance. The roads were intact. There were curb lines there indicating there were curbs at one time. The curbs were still there, but there was nothing else beyond the curb.
Now, there's a circle at Montauk.
No, the circle was not at Montauk.
No, I mean, but there is one. There's a traffic circle at Montauk.
Yes.
Was this similar in size?
It's similar in size, yes.
Is there a possibility it was the same one? Or do you think it was really
I doubt it.
one?
I doubt it because of one factor. That factor was that in the distance you could see outlines of a crumbling city. Mm-hmm. When you looked down one road line. It was rather far away. We didn't dare risk going down there. I'd estimate it was at least 10 miles away.
10. Okay, because New York would be further away than that then.
Yes.
Okay.
And you could see buildings that were there, what was left of them. You could see the road going out a good distance towards this city. You couldn't see if the road went all the way or not. And in the immediate vicinity, there was evidence that there may well have been buildings there at one time, but we didn't even see foundation stones. All we saw was the dirt and some grass, and no evidence of any life. There was no bugs, no insects, no birds.
But
nothing.
there was grass, though.
There was some grass.
So that's life.
Yes, no life is animated life, as you might say.
Okay.
And I'm adding that as because I remember right now there was a little grass, but not much, and some of it might have been lichens. In other words, a lower form of green life, which is well known, of course. But nothing we could show anything to anyone other than perhaps if we went out and dug it up and we were told not to. There was nothing on the way of grass or such in the traffic circle. That was just cinders, dirt, gravel, whatever it was, partially paved over.
So it seems like that represented a time when sort of the human existence was over.
That was what we thought it represented. We made the same reports. Whether Jack Pruitt or others had other ideas as to what it represented, we don't know. They never told us.
So why do you think 6037? Why'd they send you there?
I do not know why they chose that date.
And they sent everybody there as well.
Everybody sent to the same point.
Now, you do have a theory, which you described to me, what you thought was the reason for doing that. Do you care to share that with our listeners?
There may well have been a concealed operation involved with this. Because everybody I know that went through this thing, including myself, wound up being minus your astral body. Now, whether or not that was the real intent, was to strip the astral body by going that far into the future to where there was no longer human life forms, or whether that was part of the concealed agenda, or whether there was an accident, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. How do you know if you've lost your astral body?
For one, you can't do astral travel. Secondly, you can't get out of your body in an astral, which is, of course, something in the metaphysical standpoint. Those who understand this would know. But I've also been told that by people who observe me that I have no astral body.
Oh, they just look at you and say?
Yeah, those who are sensitive enough to be able to know that there should be an astral body there and what the astral body will look like. They said, I don't have one. And I said, I know that.
Missing in action. And have they looked at others like Preston? Well, I don't know if Preston...
I don't know about Preston, but
the
average normal person has an astral body.
How about Duncan?
Don't know.
Okay, that's very interesting. Any other interesting trips that you can talk about?
None other than I can think of at this point.
We talked about something to do with Jesus. Jesus. You want to talk about that one?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one, because that's brought up in one of the series of books that Preston has written.
Okay.
The New World Order, apparently in its deliberations, knowing, of course, that Montauk was operational and they could use it for accessing various things, decided they wanted somebody to go back 2,000 years into the past and acquire a sample of the blood of Jesus. Duncan was the person chosen to do this. And there has been some dispute as to whether he was the one or not, but that's the story I was given originally.
Do you recall who gave you that story?
Preston. He gave it to me originally. Mm-hmm. Then there's been another version of this put out by somebody else who's written a book recently, Stu Swerdlow, who claims that he was the one that went back, and I don't believe it. Because of certain things that were told to me regarding what happened to Duncan when he went back, and Preston, of course, sent him back, and then interviewed him after he was back. The story is very interesting. It goes like this. Duncan said he would be sent back there, and his mission in this trip was to get a sample of the blood of Jesus. He said, how are you going to do that? How am I going to get a sample of it? He says, we don't know, but you'll find out when you get there. Something will come up, you'll be able to do this. So he went back there, and the story is this that came out of Duncan, and of course Preston relayed this. He arrives there, he walks up to Jesus in one of his lectures, if you will, to the masses, and he said, this guy, Jesus, looks at Duncan, looks right through him. And Duncan says he had the feeling this guy could read my every thought, and he finally opens his mouth and says, I know who you are, I know where you're from, I know why you're here, and yes, you can have the sample. How he was given the sample, how it was derived, I don't know, but it was apparently was handed to Duncan. He took it back, gave it to where he was supposed to give it to, which probably was Preston, who transferred it to the appropriate interested group. And the thing that happened was everybody knew Duncan, up to that point on the station, was quite an arrogant individual. He was a know-it-all, and acted almost like he owned the station. He didn't, of course, but he sometimes acted like that. After this little trip, it did such a total change in his personality that he became very contrite, very quiet, got religion would probably be the correct expression, being as who he went to see. And he then decided at that point, and got other people to agree with him, that the station was evil, had done some very bad things. Of course it had done some bad things, but most of the serious problems it had in that respect, namely the Montauk Boys program, had been straightened out. But he decided in the last approximately 6 weeks of the operation of the station that it had to go. So he and Preston and some others hatched up a plot as to how it could be done. I was initially brought in on the meetings to see if I would agree with it, and I would not. I did not agree with it. I told Dr. Van Neumann about it, and he blew his stack. He says, we need this station for other things in the future. He says, we got other problems we know are going to come up, and we need the capability of this facility. He said, whatever serious problems there may have been are now solved. I don't see why they want to do this. So I was not part of the group that did it. What they hatched up as a plot was that basically at some point when it was appropriate in time, as the station operation went on, they would have Duncan sit in the chair, dredge up from his subconscious one of the creatures of the id, if you will, a replica of him.
Or a Sasquatch, right?
Of a Sasquatch,
yeah.
Basically. Mm-hmm. As we have the pictures of the Montauk creature, as we call it, dredge something up like that and make from his mind, clothe it in physical reality as a station was capable of doing at the appropriate time, and instruct this monster to go out and destroy the station. Well, they knew they had to wait because discussions of Van Neumann and others, it was known that Duncan and I, as the original Duncan and I, as Ed Cameron, for going to pay a visit to the station on the 12th of August, 1983.
Now, if Van Neumann knew about this before it actually happened and was against it, why didn't he stop it?
He was not in a position to stop it. He was a consultant at the station. And apparently the word...
He could have talked to Pruitt, though.
He could have. I don't know whether he did or not. And I don't know whether Pruitt did anything to stop it. This is one of the loose ends as to why didn't Pruitt stop it before it happened.
Right.
Do not have an answer to that. In any case, they decided this procedure would be followed of calling up the monster after the original Duncan and myself, as Ed Cameron, came to the station, went through the 9 yards of it, and was returned to the Eldridge. And after we had left the station was when they would put Duncan in the chair and create this monster.
Because you arrived around 2 in the morning on August the 12th.
That's right, and we were there until sometime around noon of that same day.
Okay, so this was then in the afternoon when this happened. Okay.
It was in the afternoon that they created the monster, and it took a while before they realized what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
But whether or not Pruitt gave credence to this procedure is another aspect. Maybe he didn't believe it could be done.
Now, you say Jack Pruitt is still alive.
Yes, he is.
Sure be nice if someone out there could find him and ask him these questions.
Well, he has been approached, and he refuses to talk about any aspect of Montauk, or that he was ever involved in it, or that it ever existed. For years, this was his attitude, even to his own son. When we told his son about it, he says, "How do you know it was my father?" He says, "Dig up a picture of your father, and we'll tell you whether it was him or not." This is what I and Preston both told him, and this was about 2 years ago. So he found a picture of his father and brought it to us at a time when we were both on the island. Of course, Preston's here all the time. It was one of my visits and one of the conferences, which was held in New York that I was at. He pulls out the picture, and I looked at it. He says, "Yeah." I said, "That's Jack Pruitt." He was a little thinner at the time when I saw him last, remember him, but I said, "That's Jack Pruitt." And Preston looked at him and says, "Yep, that's exactly the way I remember him." He said, "That's your father, and that's the Jack that ran the station." So Glenn said, "Well, this answers a lot of questions." He says, "I wouldn't have believed it if you two guys hadn't sworn that it's him." But he says, "We originally, the family, lived in Dallas, Texas, not here in the East Coast." And he says, during this period of time when Montauk was operational, he used to say he had to go to New York on a business periodically because he was an investment banker, and he had to take care of his investments and see certain people in New York. And he said he'd be gone for 2 and 3 months at a crack and wouldn't come back. And we couldn't figure out why he was there for so long. I says, "No, I think you have a little better idea why." And I said, my recollection, or I should say rather information I had from other people at one of the conferences who knew Jack Pruitt, mentioned him by name, and said that he ran Montauk and that he was actually in the Air Force. And I asked Glenn this. I said, "Do you know whether or not your father was ever in the Air Force?" He says, "Not that I know of." I says, "Well, information I have indicates he was." He says, "I do not know that he was ever in the Air Force." So that is still an unknown aspect. Unless we could get Jack Pruitt to sit down with Preston and myself and talk, which he is rather reluctant to do, he will not admit that this project existed, much less that he was part of it.
Yeah, it would be interesting, though, if he did, wouldn't it?
It would be most interesting if you get him to talk.
Well,
someday he may decide to, but at this point we know he doesn't want to.
Yeah.
He's remarried, and
he may not remember any of it, though.
I think he remembers most of it.
You think so?
But this is, again, conjecture on my part.
Have you ever actually seen him? Have you seen him as Al Bielek in this reality?
Oh, yeah, as a station master.
No. Well,
since then.
Yeah, since then. Okay, so when you left Montauk, then you had.
That was the last time I saw him.
Got it. Let's go back to a little bit on Duncan, because that's who we're covering right now. There was a very significant event which happened where he had to be regressed to that new body. Just real quickly, tell us what happened, because we really have two Duncans here.
Yes.
We have the Duncan who was your brother with the Philadelphia experiment, and now we have another Duncan who's in his 40s.
Yeah.
So people are going to get confused. Explain how that happened.
Well, they're both my brothers because they both were born of the same father. Different mothers, but the same father. Now, the original Duncan, when he jumped off the side of the Eldridge the second time as it was phasing back in too long to the area outside of Philadelphia, when it was dropping back out of the Philadelphia experiment phase from August 12th. We had destroyed the equipment and it was coming back, so to speak. Duncan ran to the railing and decided he didn't want to stick around with what he saw and jumped overboard and wound up back in Montauk. As the records which were accessible to us later indicated, sometime in late 82 or early 83, we're not exactly sure when. He was there about 3 months as the original Duncan. And then in one of the little side trips in one of the tunnels in which he was used extensively at that time as the original Duncan, there was always instructions. For reasons we don't understand, these tunnels sometimes develop side tunnels. Never, under any circumstances, go down the side tunnels. We don't know where they go or what they will mean or what is involved with them. Just don't. Well, you don't say that to Duncan. So on one of these little trips, he decided to go down one of the side tunnels. And he got trapped. He was apparently under control of an alien group. And they sent a message back from one of the tunnels that, well, we have Duncan here, and we'll send him back to you, but we want something. Oh, well, what do you want that's so important? And this gets into the aspect, again, we talked about earlier, of the alien ship which was trapped in the underground of Montauk. They wanted back a certain part of that ship which was important to them. Why this interconnection with another alien group, I do not understand. I do not know the answers to this. But they said, we want the power source that is on board that ship. And we knew there's one there, but we didn't know what to do with it and didn't know how to handle it, so we left hands off of it. We want this thing back. Handle it very carefully. We'll give you instructions what to do. You bring it back here through the tunnel to us, we'll release Duncan to you. So somebody there, and I don't know if it's Preston or who, got the device, shipped it back through the tunnel to these guys, wherever they were, and they released Duncan to us. And it was because of that, when Duncan came back, that he had lost his time locks and he was starting to age at a rate of about a year an hour. Mm. And this was, of course, the original Duncan.
What year again was this, you think, at 83?
It's later 82 or early 83 that this happened.
Okay.
Probably very early 83, let's say January, February. Mm-hmm. And he was aging very rapidly, and because of this, this was after the whole sequence of the Philadelphia experiment, but in terms of Duncan's lifeline, in terms of, let us say, history as we would observe it, this point where he was aging very rapidly, of course, occurred before he returned in 83, that is in the 12th of August. So it becomes hard to actually put down on a chart exactly what happened when. But in any case, he was dying, and at this point, because of his very rapid aging, they couldn't really stop the aging process. They said they just didn't know how to do it. Even the aliens said they couldn't do it. So they sent the message back through the tunnel to Father to quick get busy, marry again, or whatever's necessary. We need a new son because Duncan's dying. We can't allow him to die. We'll have to transfer the soul to the new body. That was done on the 12th of August, 1983, that he was transferred to that point.
Okay, now here's where it's confusing, because you don't just make a child in a couple of hours. I mean,
no, they had to go back prior to 1950. They had to go back to about 1949, and that's what they were hoping, that the first child would be a son, and it wasn't. It was a daughter. The second one was a son who was born on June 28th, 1950, 51.
So did they have to contact your father?
Yes, directly.
At a previous point in time, though?
That's correct. So this raises some more interesting issues about Father. How much did he really know?
Exactly. But, I mean, I couldn't imagine getting someone visit me and saying, okay, whatever, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, we have a problem, you need to get busy and make a son for us.
Yes. I'm sure that if they came to him cold turkey and said something like that, they'd probably say, "You're nuts, who the hell are you?" Or something like that.
Unless he knew what was going on.
Unless he already knew what was going on.
That's why I say there has to be something much more to this man than we know about.
I would agree with that without any question.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, why would he be pulled into a world planning conference in Dortmund, Germany in 1956 with the world leaders, the four main world leaders?
Indeed.
For him to be there, it was not an accident, and for him to be there says that he had to be far more knowledgeable about certain things than we understand, even now. It would be very interesting if I could go back and talk with him at a time when he had, let's say, complete grasp of his facilities, knew exactly what was going on, and knew what his position was in all of this. It would be most interesting if I could talk with him.
Maybe if we can get a time tunnel here, you could do that.
If we could get a time machine going of our own, yes, we might be able to do that.
Well, I tell you, it's been a remarkable, 80 minutes that we've been talking about Duncan and many other side trips. So with that, Al, thank you, and we look forward to the next one.
Thank you.